Good morning, survivors, and happy Tuesday. I am so excited today because, well, it's Tuesday, but not really. All right. So I am excited, though, because I'm looking forward to this new series that we've been working on. So stay tuned for that. Also, I thought today we would talk about imposter syndrome and how it affects narcissistic abuse survivors. Okay, so let's get started. So what's the definition of imposter syndrome? Well, it's essentially a concept that people who are intelligent and high achieving tend to have, and they typically internalize imposter syndrome. Where they actually feel like they're a fraud. They feel like all of their accomplishments are fraudulent. Like what if somebody finds out I'm just me? What if somebody finds out? I've experienced this as well. When I was a child, I always believed that everything I thought and everything I felt was not as important or as real as what everyone else felt. And I don't know that I worried that people would discover I was a fraud, but I just believed that I wasn't a real person. And I think that's common for narcissistic abuse survivors. In fact, it continued throughout my adulthood until I was just about, 5, 6, 7 years ago. So it's interesting. And at some point I thought to myself, oh my gosh, I really am a real person. But it took a long time for me to get there. So, it's a persistent fear of being exposed as a fraud. Okay, I'm going to give you some information. The term was coined in 1978 by two psychologists, women, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes. And of course, basically, despite any external evidence that you may have of your own competence, the syndrome convinces you that you're a fraud and you don't deserve the success you've achieved. So proof of success is dismissed as just good luck or good timing or whatever. So it's unfortunate. But what it comes down to is that when you have imposter syndrome, you might worry that other people will find out that you're not as smart or as capable as you seem to be. And you doubt your own intelligence and capability levels. So how is this related to narcissistic abuse? Well, I think that, because we grow up in a situation or we're in a situation with our romantic partners or whatever, where we're being told constantly that, you know what, you're not enough. And I think that brings us to the place where we think we're not enough. What do you think? Something that's interesting about imposter syndrome is that it actually happens a lot to very intelligent people. And it's because anytime they do accomplish anything, it feels like someone on their side is, it feels fake to them. It feels like it's not real. They feel like they've duped everyone. They feel like they've spent a lot of time creating, like when you feel like, okay, I know all these things, I'm really good at this stuff, but I can't believe they really like me, or I can't believe they really think I know what I'm talking about, and I think this happens a lot to child abuse survivors, but it also happens to narcissistic abuse survivors. And it's something that I was never able to identify before in myself. And if you look at my early writing on this topic, you will see that I talked about the feeling of being fake, not being real, not being a real person, because that is something that when you're raised around narcissists or by narcissists, you are taught very early that you don't matter, that you're not as important as them, that in fact you're not real, that your opinions and your thoughts and your feelings don't matter. So it only makes sense that we would get imposter syndrome when we're raised that way. And then if you're dealing with narcissism in your romantic relationships, same deal with friendships that are long-term. But I think that, at least in many cases, those of us who are raised in such a way that we're taught from the day we're born that we don't matter as much as other people, and that we should take less and accept less, and that we should minimize our accomplishments and our abilities, well, that's where it all starts. What do you think about that? So a couple more points of interest regarding this whole deal. One of the things I found interesting is that it's perceived in a larger percentage of women than men. High-achieving women tend to have this issue more than men. And another thing I found interesting was that gifted people in general will find themselves working especially hard to prove that they're not a fraud. I think it's outrageous and almost offensive, but it literally creates this feeling in yourself where you just, you assume everyone else is real and you assume you're not. You don't even think that your interests are real interests. I mean, it's so silly. And it's not silly at all. It's actually a very painful way to be. But the reason I think it's connected to narcissistic abuse syndrome, at least in the respect of having it be a comorbid condition, although it's not considered a psychological disorder. It's just considered a perception, really. It's been studied as a reaction to certain situations, and it's a response experienced by many people to various situations. It's not just narcissistic abuse survivors who experience this, but I see it as one of the side effects of narcissistic abuse. If you look at my early writings about this stuff, about narcissism and narcissistic abuse, which I originally wrote, sort of as a self-therapy thing, because I'm a nerd, and I did so much research and wrote it out so I could understand it. So I ended up sharing it with my blog people, and that's what eventually led me to here to you today. So because people were able to identify with me, I guess. But in the early forms, in the early writing, I said, back in 2005, I was saying, you feel like you're not a real person. And I never really had an official way to acknowledge that, or to, I never had a label for it before, except that you feel like you're not a real person. Now, when you have imposter syndrome, you may try to convince people around you that you're not smart or capable because you don't want them expecting too much from you. And that is something that is overwhelming, I think, for people. I don't know that I did this myself, but I think that I always felt the need to prove myself to people, and I don't have that anymore, thank goodness. But it took healing from narcissistic abuse for me to, it took intentional healing for me to get to that place. So something to think about. People with imposter syndrome will often feel like they're phony too. Like I said, they feel like they're not a real person. And it turns out, according to research, that women typically who have imposter syndrome will often use charm and sexuality and things like that in order to advance their way in business, which I find confusing. But I kind of get it, I guess. I kind of get it. I personally don't think it's a great idea, and I personally wouldn't recommend it to anyone, but I think, because I think people get used when they do that. But I get it. So, in the early 1980s, 2 out of 5 successful people considered themselves frauds, according to a psychological study that was done. And other studies have said that, as many as 70% of people feel like a fraud at some point or another in their lives. So I would say this all comes down to perception. You have to choose your perception of yourself and of your life. What do you think? According to research, like I said, this is most prevalent in females and also prevalent in African Americans, based on the studies, which I found interesting, because they say that while it has affected approximately 70% of people over the years, if it's not addressed, victims can develop anxiety, stress, low self-confidence, depression, shame, and self-doubt. So those who do suffer from imposter syndrome tend to focus on their own failures as opposed to their own successes. I've seen this even recently in people where when something goes wrong in their lives, they just freak out. Everything's terrible. And they just, they only focus on the negative. And so this is part of the reason that I tell you guys every day, think of 10 things you're grateful for and 3 things you love about yourself, because this is one way to combat this issue. You have to change your perception of yourself. You feel me? So they say the best type of therapy for this is called coherence therapy, and that it holds emotional learning requires a person to act and respond with certain behaviors, moods, feelings, or beliefs. Unlike cognitive therapy, coherence therapy asserts that it can address our most fundamental learning, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Basically, again, like I said, this is about perception. It's about your ability to perceive yourself as a real person. And so that's something I want to work on with you guys. If you're interested in that, does anyone have imposter syndrome in my group here? Do any of you guys feel like you're not a real person, or have you felt that way before? And if you do, please leave me a comment and tell me about it and how I can help you with it. And if you don't, tell me that too. If you've experienced it and you've gotten over it, let me know how that worked out for you so that maybe you can help one of your fellow survivors. Everybody has some good advice sometimes, right? So anyway, I'm going to wrap up. I've got to get my girl to school, do my thing. So I'll see you guys later today for another video. All right? Have a wonderful day. And thanks so much for being there. Thanks for being a part of my day and a part of my life. I'll see you soon. Oh, and thanks for letting me be a part of yours. It really does mean a lot to me.